Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and as if you're looking at the screen, you might see that the Fine Print group has now grown. I'd like to first thank Carey Wedler for joining us. I've had the privilege and pleasure of doing two interviews with her. I think her content is really great, and really thrilled to have her accept joining us today. And as always, we have Bruce, Dennis, and Ryan. Um, I think I think a couple of there's a lot of interest. We always have interesting stuff to talk about. I'd like to just take notice of a few things and then maybe turn it over to Bruce on what topic you'd like to do. One, I found it interesting that apparently there's a record that Pam Bondi also agrees with the seditious six, so we can make it a seditious seven. That she also agrees that the military should not follow unlawful, illegal orders, and that they have no obligation to do so. So maybe Trump needs to send somebody over to arrest the attorney general. And I think at one point he suggested that they should all be killed, right? The death penalty for all of them. So I guess we got to start looking for. I guess the deputy attorney general will now soon be the attorney general, since he should be arresting her. She should already be imprisoned, and they should get out the noose and give her the Jeffrey Epstein treatment. So another irony, something that I always talk about, that the law that's probably the least respected law of all laws, of all axioms, is the law of unintended consequences. And so what was the application of the law on unintended consequences? We put these huge tariffs on to try and damage the Chinese economy, and now the Chinese economy has had the greatest period of time of for the first time they hit $1 trillion trade surplus. So their trade surplus, maybe a lot less with us, but a lot more with everything else in the world. And we don't know how many goods other people are buying from the Chinese now that they might have previously been bought from Americans. So we don't know how much American goods, American merchandise has been displaced by China now focusing on other markets, and maybe China is replacing goods made in America, or somewhere else. So we do know that, in spite of the fact that Trump keeps denying it, we do know that there is an affordability crisis in the country. People are feeling that. Businesses are laying people off. The stock market reflects basically the performance of just a few companies, and it's not a very broad-based rally. So over the broad base, it doesn't look like the stock market, the economy is very strong. But there's been a lot of capital allocated, a lot of betting on, a small segment of the economy that's doing very, very well, but a small segment of the economy that doesn't necessarily employ a lot of people. And the only information that we have so far regarding our industrial base is it's not growing. So the tariffs were supposed to increase, it has made the trade deficit, a little bit smaller, but the concept reality is real wages are not rising, employment is not booming, new plants and new factories are not opening up. So all the things that the tariffs were supposed to accomplish to make us, quote, more secure as a nation, the only evidence is that we're less secure as a nation. And then when we talk about now, it's kind of ironic. The other thing I want to mention is today is the day that the courts are hearing the Humphreys executor case, and about government power, and the unitarian executive, and the president having complete control of the executive branch. And ironically, what else do we have? We have Netflix having won an acquisition. Now we have of Netflix, and Netflix. I mean, Netflix of the Warner Brothers. Now we have basically Paramount making a hostile bid, and Trump has said he personally would intervene in the decision about whether the Netflix Warner Brothers has have antitrust issues, and that he will personally get involved. In doing that. I don't know if that's what the Congress had thought. So he has his buddy, Ellison, and Ellison's son making the competitive bid. And one of the things that they've promoted on why their bid is a better bid to the management is they've said their bid is more, their bid is more likely to get closed and easier closing. So what do you think they mean by that? It's more likely to close and might be easier to close. Well, they might meet, just maybe they mean they have a friend in the White House that wants to see them win the company, not the other. And we have a guy who says, and the president said also, when I want to control a company, whether I put money in or whatever, just to get me to approve a deal, I might want governance rights. I might want all these other things. So it's kind of ironic, as I hope as the Supreme Court is listening to the arguments today, regarding Humphrey's executor, and Bruce will remind us that was a 9-0 decision. And the person who wrote the decision was a former president before he went on to the court. And he did not believe the president should have that type of power. And I think we had other justices of both conservative philosophy and considered progressive liberal philosophy that unanimously agreed. And some of them were very people and historically were very prominent jurists on the Supreme Court. It was people like George Sutherland, a very well respected conservative, along with Brandeis was, I think, one of the judges there. I think Cardozo might have been one of the judges on the Supreme Court at that point in time. So it was a talented group of jurists at the time, of both liberals, progressives, and conservatives, and they all unanimously agreed that they were not really thrilled with the concept as it's being, embraced today. And then the final point I'll raise is just up, then I'll turn it over to you, Bruce, is would James Monroe be happy about how Trump is using the Monroe Doctrine? So, so
yeah.
Bruce, why don't you and if there's something else that's interesting you, Bruce, speak up. But these are some of the things I wanted to throw out as ideas, and and let's see where we go with them.
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. Just a few details on Humphrey's executor. So, this was at a time with almost limitless delegations of congressional power to the president. It came at the same time as decisions called Schechter Poultry and Panama Refining, which said that Congress could not give the president, limitless power to regulate the economy, including striking industrial.
Oh, we lost Bruce.
Well, it sounds like he dropped out. So if we want to throw to Carey or Dennis.
Dennis, you want to, you might not want to talk about Humphrey's executor. Where would you like to go in Bruce's absence?
Turn.
Yeah, I'm watching what's going on with China, and there's no question that the United States trade policies under both Democrat and Republican have contributed to a destructive undermining of our strategic industrial base, which for years has provided a middle class standard of living for people who perhaps didn't have a college education, but who were well skilled in making steel, automotive products, aerospace products, ships. And as a result, that has affected not only our local economies, but it's affected our national security. So we're in a situation now in America where, because we've had a transition in our economy from one where we make things, manufacturing economy, to financialization of the economy, that automatically has jettisoned a significant part of the population who may benefit somewhat from investments in retirement funds that have grown on through Wall Street's action. But in the long term, we've seen slowly but surely across middle America in particular, parking lots with grass growing in them where people used to make washing machine and refrigerators or cars or any number of products. Small machine shops, which were the backbone of these industries, just disappear. And so our inability to make things has basically been exported to China. And China has capitalized in so many ways. They've capitalized in AI. Well, our AI is still directed to this financialized economy. China is using AI to continue to perfect its industrial model. And that has even more consequences. We are so far in America, we're so far behind now. And we have no choice but to buy things made in other places. And even though the president said several months ago, we want to start making things, there is a time curve for development of redevelopment of America's industrial base will take quite a while. And there's a whole different there's a whole different amount of planning that has to go into it. And the time curve is probably 5 years at least before we could start to make things and consume them and buy them. Meanwhile, you've got this erosion of the economy here. This idea of lack of affordability goes hand in hand with the deterioration of our of America's ability to make things here. So China is perfecting that model of taking care of their own people. That doesn't mean that that's a model. I'm not promoting the Chinese model, because with it has come loss of freedom, but we're losing freedoms here too. As I've said before, just to conclude this point, you can't have a political democracy with the freedoms that attend to it unless you have an economic democracy. And that is being put out of the reach of many people.
So that's an excellent point. What I find interesting is the way Trump's administration is responding to that, arguing, I mean, rightly so, tapping into that obvious need. I see that in everything they're doing and not really delivering. And I don't know whether you think that he meant to do that and is not achieving it. The 5-year window, that's an excellent point. They must know that. So what's the real agenda? Like, they're convincing Americans that they are going to bring things back to America and rebuild, but they're leaning even heavier into the same AI direction, which seems to be outsourcing everything, so it's another sleight of hand. It's an interesting overlap.
Right. Well, yeah, and another thing that's going on with that, and Jeffrey, I'm sure are aware of this, is that China over the last 18 months has dramatically changed its position with respect to how much they've held in U.S. Treasuries. I mean, they've been slowly getting out of that, and so I remain concerned about the viability of an economy which depends only on financial products, or mainly on financial products. Jeffrey?
Carey, you want to? I have something, but I want to give Carey her chance first before
Sure.
I comment.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at it in a philosophical sense, because we had briefly discussed the national security document, and there's a lot about economics in there. And I think what disturbs me or concerns me, aside from all the things you guys are talking about, is this kind of conflation and blurring the lines between the government, the state, and the people and the economy. And there's this kind of like blurred line. It's we must do this and we must do that. And it's not really clear. Well, are you talking about government policy that you're going to impose? Are you talking about the private sector? And it's, to me, this is reflected in a lot of different places and a lot of different topics. But as usual, this is coming to bear in the economy, and with the way that Donald Trump is handling it, the way he's portraying it, like you guys are talking about. And I think it's a little alarming when you look at, say, the effects of tariffs. That could be a we policy. We have imposed tariffs, but that's the government doing it. And I think it's becoming this kind of like nationalistic, it's always a nationalistic narrative, but I see it happening on the economy as well. And I think that gets really sticky when you see as much intervention from either side, from Republicans or Democrats, but now it's coming from Republicans in the name of populism and nationalism. And that's concerning to me.
Yeah, I agree with everything Carey had to say, and I'll add to that. Let's look at the circumstances that I think that has led to some of the erosion of the amount of inequality we see in the economy now, and some of the erosion for so many people, not doing very well. Okay, first we used to have sound money. We don't have sound money anymore. Okay, the reason why we get so much financial speculation the way we do is because we have unsound money. Okay, given the fact that we have volatility in monetary policy and we have volatility in expectations about monetary policy, we have volatility about and Bruce is back. Given the fact that we have volatility about Bruce, we switched to another topic in your absence, so we'll get back to Humphrey's executor right after this. So we engage in a lot of speculation. We engage in a lot of speculation because we have probably a fraudulent monetary regime. It's not coincidental, that the sector that's the most crony is the sector that's the most heavily regulated, which is the financial sector. So first, how did we start off the quote the progressive era in the beginning of the 20th century? Okay, we decided we wanted to have an income tax. Okay, and we wanted to tax. At first, we didn't really tax a lot of people. We taxed a small percent of people, and then we expanded the tax base because we decided to be an empire. So when we decided to be an empire, we need a lot more money to be an empire than we have just a sovereign nation comprised of sovereign individuals. So once we decide we need an empire, you can't be an empire and have a sound money regime. So once you decide to be an empire, you have to embrace a fraudulent money regime. So you have to start debasing and defrauding money in order to finance being an empire. Okay. Then, because we made a whole lot of policy mistakes with respect to now that we had a central bank and now that we were making stupid decisions, the central bank and the government was making stupid decisions, like implementing a tariff regime, trying to figure out what the right price is between the dollar and gold rather than the market doing that. We had a lot more government intervention. And what happened with all this government intervention? We had a depression. Then when we had the depression, how to respond to the depression? Even more government intervention, wage and price controls, all these regulatory bodies got to put in place. Okay, so if we've seen an erosion of our base, is because of the fact is we've decided to penalize initiative, or control it, or we control it. We started out with an economy in the beginning of the 20th century where the government did almost no intervention, and now basically you have the government controlling directly or indirectly more than 80-90% of the economy. So government is basically controlling to a great extent how capital gets allocated through how the SEC operates, through how the banking system operates, through how the Fed operates, how the tax regime, the regulatory regime, the rent seeking from the regulatory regime. So once you get the government involved and the government is making decisions that have consequences and are picking winners and losers, then you'll get a lot of people wanting to influence. So government intervention and cronyism go together. The more the government intervenes, the more corrupt the economy gets, and the less productive it gets, because the winner is a function of a political contest, not necessarily an economic contest. Now we're sitting out, we say, we love AGI, we love AI, so let's go out and let's take out of the mothballed nuclear power plants, and the government will actually provide financing for these companies to build, their own AI, platforms, or off government money. We have Elon Musk became the wealthiest guy on the planet, as he is acknowledged, through government subsidies. So and I don't even understand how people think. We have no real structural unemployment. Most of the people unemployed are unemployed for a short period of time, and the ones that are employed for a long period of time, there's a good reason why they're unemployed, because they have almost no skills that's valuable to anyone, and that's their fault, okay? So most of the people who are unemployed for a long period of time, it's their fault, okay? We might have bad economies at some point in time where people have temporary layoffs for a period of time, but at the end of the day, many people have decided that the government gives them enough money to be unemployed, and they can stay home, and so make other decisions, so that we've actually raised the wages of people being unemployed to the extent that we've changed the trade-off between them going back. And we discovered this in 2008, 2009, when we had the financial crisis. What happened? We had this long period of time of unemployment. Then the government said we're no longer going to give unemployment benefits out, and suddenly employment recovered again, because people said, well, I'm coming home, the government's writing me a check because they say the state of the world is bad and it's not my fault, I don't have a job. And, I agree with the government, it isn't my fault, so I'm happy to take a paycheck. And suddenly the government says, well, we agreed maybe it wasn't your fault for a few weeks, maybe for a few months, but now, a year has passed, and you decided you're comfortable not looking for work because you can't find the ideal job, and you're not prepared just to work, to have some dignity and self-respect and support your family, and you're just happy that you're getting enough money from us, where the type of job you're willing to take, given the money we're giving you now, will change once we stop giving you the money, and that's what happened. So my remedy is very simple, okay? Shrink the government so it does almost nothing, okay? Shrink the government so it does almost nothing, okay? Now nobody's paying an income tax, okay? Get rid of all regulation, okay? Almost all of it is terrible. Rely upon contracts, and liability created through contracts, okay? So we abolish the personal income tax, we abolish the corporate income tax, and then we abolish most of the regulations that deter investment. We abolish the SEC, so we make it easy for any entrepreneur to raise money. And we should live in a world, as an adult world. There's a words that were used, throughout history. It's called caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Okay, that should be market regulation. Market regulation should be each person who's an adult has to regulate their own behavior. How about that as an idea? An adult actually being capable of regulating their own behavior. And my definition is, if you can't regulate your own behavior, you're not an adult, okay? I don't care what age you are. You could be 35, 45, 75, 95, 105. If you can't regulate your own behavior, what is our definition of adulthood? It shouldn't just be a certain age, okay? I think adulthood means more than just being of a certain, that you've reached to a certain age. There's supposed to be a maturity that has gotten with that age. There's supposed to be a wisdom associated with getting to that age, and you're not an adult if you can't be accountable and responsible for your own decisions and your own actions, and live with the consequences of your own actions. So if we lived in a world here in the United States where we decided to abolish regulation, abolish the Fed, have a sound money regime chosen by the marketplace, okay, we would end rent-seeking behavior because the government would be around to do almost nothing for us. So since the government's around nothing for us, people would have to compete to actually convince the customers to do things for themselves because they can't rely upon the government doing it for them. And then if we have a self-reliant society of people who are really eager to work and do what they need to do to work because they know if they aren't there, okay, the only safety net they have is through the philanthropic efforts of people. And throughout history, we've shown that Americans are philanthropic people. If you don't overtax them and don't overregulate them, Americans are philanthropic. So philanthropy would solve a lot of the problems of those. It's not a perfect solution, but today we don't have a perfect solution. Today we have a very imperfect solution. So we can't sit and argue and saying, well, this is imperfect. Every decision we come up with is imperfect. The question is the least bad. If we did that, believe me, every company in the world would want to be manufacturing in the United States to the extent that the human capital was available. But of course, we won't have enough human capital. So maybe now we won't be so upset about immigrants coming into the country because we're going to need a lot more jobs, because we're going to need a lot more people, because we don't have enough human capital to support how many people would want to make stuff in the United States, that would want to operate in the United States. So we've pushed people out. Okay, this is done by both Democrats and Republicans, okay, who think they know better, okay? They think they know better. They don't know any better. And this is the results of people thinking that they can outsmart the markets, okay? So that's my remedy. And I believe that many of the founders would be supporting my position. They were not big, except for maybe Alexander Hamilton. They were not big on government intervention. They were not big in taxing people. And they wanted people to live in liberty and responsible for how they pursued happiness on their own. Okay, and nobody was guaranteed any outcome. And Madison said it very clearly: the function of the government is not to dole out charity. Okay, so we said that, right, Bruce?
Yeah, it was more Jefferson, that you should let labor to keep the bread that it earns, than Madison.
But Madison also said charity is not the business of government.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. But I think he was taking the lead from Thomas Jefferson. And I think if you see, especially with regard to immigration, One of the grievances against King George III was that he was restricting immigration to the United States. And when you look at the enumerated powers of Congress in Article 1, Section 8, it's empowered to regulate naturalization of immigrants, not removing them, just how quickly they could become citizens. And of course, you had the likes of Gallatin and others. It was immigrants. We're all traced back to immigrants, you know. The only ones aren't the Native American Indians. And it was an idea that meritocracy was our ambition, even though we fell short at the outset. And that's what makes us unique and different. We judge everyone by two characteristics alone: accomplishments and character. That's it. Other than that, you're an American if you work hard and subscribe to the rule of law and display the kind of benevolence in the industry that we expect every human being can.
So I think we've tried democratic solutions, we've tried Republican solutions, we've tried conservative solutions, we've tried liberal solutions, we've tried populist solutions. Okay, you know, we've tried all different branches. We tried a compromise of solutions from all those groups, coming up with their own amalgamated mess of solutions. Okay, I think it's time to do the solution I suggested. Let's give that a chance. Okay, a lot of government we've tried for a long period of time. Okay, people who argue that they can make government smarter. Okay, I would not listen to anyone who thinks they can make government smarter. Anyone who thinks they can make government smarter, you know, as someone who basically, well, you do show when you go to government, you do become smarter as an investor because you're trading on usually privileged information and then profiting off privileged information. So I guess it makes them smarter as an investor, you know, in allocating capital. But that's because of how they're tilting the game, you know, because they seem to perform much better as an investor when they enter Congress than, you know, enter government than before they went into government. You know, it seems to be a huge increase in their returns on trading. So somehow the act of being in DC, I guess it's a collective wisdom of all those smart, brilliant people in a room. I guess they all get smarter and they all become much wonderful investors. But we know what the real truth is. The real truth is they're corrupt. Okay, they're fraudulent, corrupt actors. Okay, they don't know better than anyone else. And why would we think we get a whole bunch of people, you know, in a room and that they think that they can make decisions on behalf of all of us? Okay, so I don't. That's not the system I think the founders really designed. And you know, I don't think they certainly would like the industrial plan that's in this. That's in the national security strategy document, whatever it is. And so you know, I think when I'm concerned about, you know, we should not be concerned about, you can't control what anybody else does. So you shouldn't be concerned about what other people do because you have no control over it. You can control just your own behavior. Okay. And if your own behavior is driven by what other people do, then you basically have subordinated yourself to them. You've basically said, I've surrendered my sovereignty. So if I'm going to do things because China does something or Russia does something, I do something because I think it's the smartest thing to do. Okay. And if I think it's the smartest thing to do, then over the medium to long term, I know it will prevail because I think it's the smartest thing to do. So you know, so I don't want to mimic these countries. What's the quality of our standard of living of a typical American versus a typical Chinese? It's so much better. It's so much better there. If we opened our border to China and it was easy for people to leave, how many more Chinese do you think would move here? Okay, they would move here because as bad as it is, you know, on where I think we would like to be on the freedom scale, we're still a lot better than almost everywhere else in the world. And that's why so many people want to come here, is because they come here because of the fact is that wherever they are, it's still a lot better here.
Yeah.
Okay. Even though it should be a lot better than it is, they still want to come here.
Jeffrey,
I don't want to reproduce the China model. I don't want to reproduce any other country's model. I want us. There's one truism that's been demonstrated empirically, is that long-term economic wealth is tied to economic freedom. Okay, so we got to figure out how to be the most economic free country. We used to know that. You know, that's how we became from, you know, 13 colonies, you know, to one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, starting with 13 colonies of people from immigrants from all over the place who didn't get. Did George Washington have an industrial plan? I might have missed it there. Okay. Did Jefferson have an industrial plan? Did Madison have an industrial plan? Okay. Did they write a plan saying, I'm gonna go around the world, I'm gonna get money, I'm gonna put it into my own hedge fund, I'm gonna allocate capital, and I'm gonna set all these rules. Okay. Did any of these people do that? Okay, they said, gee, you know what I want is I want to be able to have a printing press. I'm going to print money. Okay, so that the world we live in today, okay, has destroyed both economic freedom and liberty. Okay, we got to restore it, and we're not going to restore it through Washington doing anything. We're going to restore it by sending people from Washington home, have them do almost nothing. Get rid of the central bank, get rid of all the regulatory agencies. And then we really wouldn't have to talk very much about Humphrey's executor, because there would be nobody to execute because these agencies wouldn't exist. Okay. So that's my remedy. Okay. And that should be the people's remedy. And that's what we should learn is if we were adults, okay, my remedy is a remedy that adults believe in. Okay. Children who want to be taken care of, okay, they don't believe in that remedy because they're still children. They're infants who want to be taken care of. Okay. So that's an infant. Okay. Mine is an adult remedy. Okay. For real adult.
The others have been very patient. I just want to add this before I want to get their input. And by the way, it's Humphrey's executor, not executor. I'm
making a point. I know.
But in Jeffrey, it was Adam Smith beat you to the punch in his theory of moral sentiments. He said all it takes to take a country in the greatest poverty and degradation to opulent wealth is peace, easy taxes, and a fair administration of justice. All the rest will take itself by the natural order of things. And he wrote that like 3 centuries ago, right? But we know that people who get attracted to politics, Dennis perhaps an exception, they're largely sociopaths. They want to run other people's lives. That's why they're there in government. And it's been ignored all these times. So anyway, Adam Smith, I think, deserves to get the credit as being first on the block. Anyway, let's let the others.
That's why I didn't call it my plan. I didn't say it's the Wernick plan. I'm not the original author of it. Okay. So that's why I wouldn't put the plan after me, because I'm not the author of it. I'm taking the knowledge that's been accumulated from the writings of people like Adam Smith. That unfortunately every American nobody should graduate high school without having read, his 2 major tomes of work. The one on the wealth of nations and the other on moral sentiments. So they should be, required reading. A lot of things should be required reading that aren't required reading. We graduate a generation of functionally illiterate, stupid people who can't solve math problems, who can't read for comprehension. But they learn a lot about victimhood. So
on the point of the U.S. being, the sought after country, it's an interesting point because historically that's been something that has been broadly kind of regarded by Americans, by people who want to go to America to be free. And over a long period of time doing this, I don't think that's the view of most people in the world anymore. But there is a valid point to be made about this. There's plenty of more despotic places in the world. But I don't know. I'm curious where the rest of the panel thinks we actually grade on that in the world today, because it seems to carry over from different times. And if you really stand back and look at where we are, and I think we all agree, it's rapidly gone crazy in just this administration, but it's not unique to Trump, that we are watching, we're at a place right now that's worse than a lot of places that we regard as being dystopian in the world. So it's an interesting transition, but I argue that that's being used to drive us into a place where we make choices where, it's in the interest of the agenda. But, where do you feel like we place in the world today on that real scale, of who's more free?
Well, I don't know. The president then took after Europe. I mean, with a statement, basically, tribalism, that sounds like it came out of the 1930s in Nazi Germany, that Europe is destroying itself because it permits people to come in who weren't born there. They're immigrants. And it doesn't matter the quality of the immigrants. Automatically, if you're not of the same white Anglo-Saxon Protestant religion or whatever, you're a beast. I mean, this really goes to tribalism that is the source of most of the wars and clashes in the world. And Europe, of course, coming with our destruction of Libya, those immigrants weren't coming to the United States. They're going to Germany and Europe across the Mediterranean. Some ended up in the United States, but it shows that the United States is becoming less attractive because of our reputation as being xenophobic, which is certainly deserved, certainly with the Trump administration. And that's self-defeating. We're going to end up with not getting the best and the brightest. We won't be the recipient of the brain drain. There are other countries in the world that are smart enough and are accepting them, Spain, Germany especially, and France and other places. But it goes back, I believe, to the fundamental principle of what America was. It was an idea. This was the first time in the history of the world that we looked at people not as a position on a hierarchy based upon birth. Are you a squire? Are you a king? Are you a queen? Are you a Brahmin? Are you whatever? No, everybody starts out at the same in the eyes of God and dignity. And all we care about is your accomplishments and character. Then you're an American. We're going away from that. You know, we're getting isolated. We're being fearful. Anybody who comes in doesn't look like us. It doesn't smile the same way, doesn't sing the same psalms. We get terrified of, hey, you don't look like us. They say, this is tribalism on steroids, you know. We'll be like Lebanon, you know, with perpetual sectarian divisions. That's the opposite of what we were at least our aspiration was in 1776 and in the Constitution. We have to get away from this. This tribalism is going to kill us.
Bruce, I would insist that the reason why there's tribalism is government picks winners and losers. Okay. So given the fact that the government picks winners and losers, people don't want to be on the winning, people don't want to be on the losing team. They want to be on the winners team. You know, the government is not making decisions, you know, in what would be an economist would call a Pareto optimal fashion. Okay. So they're doing it on just brute force and politics. So basically once you create a system where the government going to say, you know, who's going to win, you know, is it going to be Paramount, you know, or is it going to be Netflix? Okay. So now the question is how much money do I have to spend to make sure I'm the winner or the loser? So you have by the government is sorting people into tribes because that's how the government treat people. So people naturally say, I want to be on the tribe that wins rather than the tribe that loses. There's less need for the less the government does, there's less need for tribalism because who are people trying to influence? If the government is irrelevant, then people are not going to spend much effort into trying to influence government, and therefore there's no need to be so tribal. I mean, people might be tribal on a local level who might want to live together because they have common attributes and they want to live with people with common attributes. But but at the end of the day, it's not those common attributes, except for maybe within their community and the people they choose in their community, are not asserting a coercive control over maybe more than half the population. So probably over the half population, because on the most part, whoever's presidents, their policies usually are not very popular. Okay.
Yeah, but
so
I think
whatever any president does, and you look at their policies, you look at specifically their very specific policies, the people don't really like, like, oh yes, I like the Obamacare, but now that the premiums are going up, gee, I'm not so happy with it. I want the subsidy to never die. Okay, so as long as the subsidy continues, I'm happy if somebody else is helping to pay my health care. I'm happy to have other people pay my health care. Okay, that's what they're really saying. A subsidy means that the amount that they pay doesn't cover the benefits they get, and they want to take money out of other people's pockets on their behalf. So yeah. I'm hungry. I want to go into my. I went into my refrigerator this morning. I didn't find what I wanted. So I'm going to go break into all my neighbors' houses and see if they have a better selection of items in their refrigerator or pantry than I have, because I'm hungry. I want to eat. That's my right to eat. It's my natural right to eat. So, since I want to eat, I have a right to take anybody's property until my appetite is satisfied. Okay.
Yeah. But I think Jeffrey, the problem is beyond the government. When you look, for example, during Jim Crow in the South, and again, talk about tribalism. Or you talk about the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland. It can be when you have a culture of tribalism, even outside the government structure, you can destroy people's liberty and freedom. When you're black in the South, you think you could get a doctor to attend you? They wouldn't sell you any groceries. They could lynch you for exercising the slightest degree of liberty. Emmett Till. And so that's why I believe tribalism is beyond just government structures. It can be built into a culture. And if you don't believe the way that we believe and go to our church, then you become ostracized. And who can survive if they're ostracized? No one wants to do business with him. So it's more, I agree with your observation about government, but it's worse than just government alone, because tribalism has private aspects to it that can be as lethal as government aspects. And we see it regularly around the world, for sure.
That's a great point, Bruce. And I agree that that exists, but I think that, I mean, that, yes, entirely, period. But additionally, you have political tribalism, which I think is really the crux of this point, right? Where we're talking about that you have both of what you just said, or both points there, where you have people that just do it because they believe in somebody and they hate the other side and they're willing to, ignore constitutional rights like we're seeing today. But I very much think, and I'm curious what Dennis and Carey have to think as well about the manufacture of the divide in order to not keep, because you know how I think. I don't think our vote truly translates today. Not that it shouldn't, but I think it's been broken and manipulated. So if we're not really involved with that, it's not about getting us involved with an outcome. It's about keeping us on the side, divided and attacking each other so they can accomplish whatever they want. And I think it's both of those things together. But I think that's important to consider because we're not involved in that process, if I'm correct in that.
Yeah.
So I think Brian threw that out to Dennis and Carey. I think Bruce and I have to, well, I'll speak for myself. I've talked enough, so for the time being. So Dennis, Carey?
Sure. I've had some thoughts coming to mind through this whole conversation, and it's bringing me to a particular topic I found really interesting lately, which is the history of big tech and how big tech came to be so entrenched with government. And it goes back to the Cold War. And I'm thinking of this because we're talking about, well, there's this tribalism, and as I tend to agree with Ryan, I see a big uniparty. And one of those issues is the military-industrial complex, the perpetual war. And when I look at something that could have been so innovative, and it is innovative within big tech, with the history of the Cold War and the history of the Pentagon seeking contracts, that entire industry really grew up around government intervention, and what was really a bipartisan policy of empire. And I find that topic just so interesting because I feel like it's a real convergence of everything we're talking about, government intervention and how that distorts demand in markets and people trying to get their cut. It's really hard to succeed in the tech industry today if you're not seeking out government contracts. And there are a lot of companies that they form and they're going right after them, like Onduril, which I think received CIA funding as an investment in Qital. And then, sorry, someone said something. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Carey.
Go ahead, Carey.
Oh, no, the last thing I was going to say is just one fine little detail that I think exemplifies it is the Onduril surveillance towers for border and immigration enforcement started. The plan was hatched under Trump. They started to be built under Biden, and now they are continuing. Oops, sorry, lost my headphone. Now they're continuing to be built. And so you have this bipartisan policy of surveillance powers of the military-industrial complex of big tech all converging. And Biden used his rhetoric to act like he opposed Trump's policies. But in the end, they continued these exact kind of things that are leading to loss of liberty, that are distorting markets because government is creating so much. I don't know if it's artificial demand. They really want it, but it's not a free market function where these big tech firms are just building AI surveillance tools. They're building AI weapons. I would have loved to have seen what could have happened if the military industrial complex hadn't polluted that industry.
Well, Carey brought up something that reflects on a much wider discussion. And I want to go back to some fundamentals here. What's the purpose of government?
Stay out of my life.
Yeah, I got that. What Lincoln was supposed to have said that government should do for people collectively what they cannot do for themselves individually. I'm here in Cleveland, Ohio. Tomorrow, government will come by and they'll pick up the recycling and the trash. There's snow. When it snows, they'll clear the streets. They have water systems. They have sewer systems. I mean, there's some essential services that government does provide for the people that they can't afford to do for themselves. Now, Lincoln raised another question, which now looks like one of the big challenges we face. He asked in the Gettysburg Address, his prayer was that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish. I think we're on the threshold of losing the idea of what the purpose of nationhood is about. Now, Carey, you talked about this military-industrial complex. one half of discretionary spending, and maybe more than one half now,
Yeah,
goes to that annually. That's our freedom. That's our ability to be able to speak, because with that money is created policies. With that money is created ways of using what it is that they make, the armaments and stuff that keep us forever at war and forever at each other's throats on these phony ideological debates. So I think government does have a salutary purpose, and we have to find it. Now, Jeffrey mentioned at the beginning about that fateful year, 1913, in which both the income tax and the Federal Reserve was created, and there needs to be some inspection about how that happened to occur almost simultaneously, because there was a point at which government was able to spend money to meet the needs without having to borrow it.
I can tell you,
Once
Dennis.
we borrow
Yes.
the money, hold on, once we borrow the money, and now we're $38 trillion in debt, we can't meet the needs of the people. We are in a debt trap. We are in a trap of financialization of the economy. We're being sped towards this one world econotechnic system that America doesn't lead. We're fueling. We're headed. We're jettisoning in. We're moving quickly into a future that's kind of a combination of Aldous Huxley and Orwell, and
Right.
and we're doing it with our eyes open. And I don't like it, and I don't like giving up personal freedoms. I don't like, taxation can be a form of giving up personal freedoms. I don't like adopting the surveillance society. I don't like ICE being able to pick up people off the streets like this is some kind of disapparados in another country. There's some things going on in America right now that show that this country is in deep danger of losing our liberty, our economic and our political liberty. And so this question of what's a country about, why are we a nation, what's the purpose of nationhood? These are fundamental questions which I'm grateful we're grappling with in these discussions. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm going to make a comment. I'm going to make a comment. Then I'm going to pass it over to Bruce.
those questions, Dennis, were addressed in the Declaration of Independence, right? We're established a country, government by the consent of the governed. What are the purposes? To secure unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It says that is the purpose, and that when a government becomes destructive of those ends, it's the right of the people to change the government to more safely secure these rights.
Or abolish it.
That's unique. It was about preserving the individual dignity to march to your own drummer, seek your own fulfillment, develop your own faculties. The individual was more important than your status as a queen or a king or a squire or a vassal or a lord or anything like that. And that's what we need to get back to. You can quibble about small issues of whether government should have a fire department or police department, but the biggest encroachment on what we were as a nation is, as Carey pointed out, it is the military industrial complex whose sole purpose is to engage and foment war, which legalizes first degree murder. There's no oversight. Cicero said thousands of years ago, in times of war, the law is silent. And that's where we are. We are an empire. I describe the United States as searching for beehives abroad, smashing them open, and then wondering, oh, the bees and the hornets are trying to sting us. We need another $1 trillion, to go prevent them. We never think, hey, why don't we not smash the beehive open? And then
I love that.
bees
Yeah,
angry.
What did Bruce? What did the founders say about what happens to a republic in a state of perpetual war?
Yeah, we lose all of our liberties. It says no country, it says, can remain free. And
Okay, so when a president says everything is a national emergency, okay, that everything I have to have absolute control of everything because it's a national emergency. And by the way, I want to get back to Humphrey, and I want to get back to conversation, because I think it's related to this, the concept of executive power.
I have one follow-up comment to Dennis before we do that, though. Go ahead.
That that I think it relates back to to these issues of the fact of sorry, I lost my chain of thought now after Ryan said something, but
sorry about that. I have a follow-up comment for Dennis then, if we're still on that topic. I think it's really important, a few different angles on this, and we touched on something really important as I see it right now. And so we talked, like you talked about what is nationhood, and you mentioned things, the trash and the snow. First on that, it's important, I think, to look at it as who do those things? People, not the government. The government directs those things, right? But people do those things. So if government doesn't exist, people can still do those things. It's about organization. So it's a different way to look at it. But I take your point in the meaning, but I think it's important to think about, the way that can operate. But when it comes to what you said, the meaning of a state, a nation, I agree with Bruce in the context of the state of society we live in, and the Constitution being the best I've seen in trying to keep these checks and balances. But what you touched on there is important to me, because right now, and what we've all been talking about over many different shows, the kind of using a problem to manufacture into a worse situation, the solution being worse than the problem, right? As Bruce points out, right now, and has been happening for almost a decade, there's a book about it called The Network State. And right now it is exploding across the world. People like Peter Thiel, the reason Trump tried to discuss Greenland, that's still up in the air, because Peter Thiel wanted it for a possible network state or charter city. They're doing it in Prosper in Honduras. All these things are wrapped up in illegality and crime. They just manipulated the situation with Hernandez in regard to the previous president and the election taking place there. I think it's worth thinking about. I think we should do a panel on this in the future, that when we're discussing what it means to be a nation, that's the very point that these people are trying to make the conversation about, as I argue, giving us things that are collapsing. So we call for this new CEO-run government, right?
Okay,
This is
God damn it.
the nation. So the nation's supposed to serve us instead of we serving the nation. And as these big tech companies align with the government, what's happening is we're being annexed by the state. I mean, think about that. We're becoming an arm of the state. They're taking over our personal freedoms. This is what goes on in China. This is what's happened when we import authoritarian government goods. We are becoming, more like them instead of exporting democracy. That's not happening right now.
It's the military-industrial complex.
I think a couple of things.
It's the military-industrial complex to technocracy. I wanted that to be heard. That's where this is going. I think that's an important thought. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
My theory on why we got the income tax is that the government basically created the Fed to bail out, to make sure that the banks don't have to figure out how to solve their own problems of not having adequate capital, that the government now would solve that problem. The problem is the government didn't have any money to solve that problem. So a guarantee is not worth anything if there's not money behind the guarantee. I could sit back and tell you, if you got $1 trillion problem, don't worry, I'll back you up. But if I have no money in the bank, okay, then people come and have recourse to me. What's the value of the guarantee? The value of the guarantee is a function of, do I have the net worth to back up, my backing up what you want me to back up? So in what I state to back up. So the government can't back up the financial system if it doesn't have any money to do so, and the government didn't have any money to do so. So they have an income tax to have money to do so, and also they wanted to go to war, to fight, to be the most. But it was both those things. But so I think that's that's the reason why I believe that we got an income tax, because the banks wanted there to be an income tax.
Yeah,
okay?
they
wanted there to be an income tax.
they?
And not all of it was about empire. It was the fact is that they no longer wanted the liability associated with what happens when they went bankrupt. They wanted to have the same benefits that they saw people in Europe go. They're sitting back and saying is, gee, if I go bankrupt, I don't want to lose I don't want any consequences to me by going bankrupt. Okay, I want to I want to socialize those things. But if I'm socializing it, the money has to be there to pay for it, so the government has to take it out of other people's pocket rather than take it out of our own pocket.
Yeah.
That's why. And then going back
it's more driven by empire. The British Bank of England was created just in order to have the British fight wars against the Dutch and the French. It was clear. And that the Fed is created 1 year before World War I. The Fed was needed in order to fund World War I. then Secretary of
And
Treasury
that
William.
that was not the only reason. The bankers did not, after the crisis of 1907, the banks didn't want to go out, and the banks wanted a lender of last resort, and they wanted a lender of last resort, had nothing to do with empire.
Did, but
They just wanted a lender of last resort.
yeah, but the empire hijacked the Fed. First thing. And that's how McAdoo said to Wilson, McAdoo, the Secretary of Treasury, there's no way that we can fight this war with raising taxes. We got to get the Fed to bail us out. And they did. That's why the national debt spiraled from $1 to $30 billion, a $3 trillion percent increase, during the war years by the time we had ended. And that's what national banks do. And it started with Great Britain the same way. But I believe that our greatest sin was abandoning the idea that the United States celebrated and honored every individual for their ability and talents and industry to commitment to our ideas, the Constitution, in order to rule the world. It was a Faustian bargain, and we're still paying for it today. What do we get? I mean, did we really feel we're great if we throw out Maduro in Venezuela? We embrace MBS, in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the idea that we're out there to overthrow governments for democracies is absurd. We reinstalled the Shah of Iran in 1953 and overthrew Mossadegh, and then Arbenz in 54 and get genocidal military dictators. So this is a total warping of what we're supposed to be as a country. And we have to handle them back in the other direction.
Thank you, Bruce, because this idea of a nation existing for purposes of empire needs to be inspected, and we're doing that. But I've got to make a remark, and then I'm going to run away. As I explained at the beginning, Jeffrey, I've got to leave it at exactly 1. I would say that and this might be a discussion for another show, but I think the ultimate empire is the empire of the mind. And we talk about the scientific method, which Francis Bacon in his Novum Organum, I think it was 1620, is given credit for helping to evolve. But I think one of the things we're locked into, this idea of you start with a problem, you end with a problem, the scientific method itself. Let's talk about the empire of the mind, where the scientific method of itself, think of a problem, think of different solutions, select the best solution, test, retest, and you still end up with a problem. I would submit that one of the great challenges we have in our time, philosophically and intellectually, is that we are straitjacketed by a way of thinking which starts with a problem and ends with a problem. And it's really time to start to inspect the underlying premises of how we think, and the implications of that scientific method, what it has brought about that might be beneficial, but where it leads us today, and whether or not we need to start to think about a different way of thinking so that we can create the world that we know is possible. So with that, nice to see all of you, and hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks,
I
Dennis.
just wanted to say my mom's going to be so excited as on a stream with you, Dennis.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've written an article called "Our Destiny is Omnicide." It's not a very optimistic one. Our ability to change our ideas from thinking the greatness of the species is improving the proficiency with which we kill each other, whether atom bombs or cyberspace or otherwise. Now, if any other animal acted like the human animal, with the tigers, lions gathering in huge numbers to kill each other, we'd say, my God, they must be infected with rabies. How crazy they are. Right. We do it all the time and don't blink an eye. I mean, we have got species narcissism, which we got to get over if we're going to try to at least address, the underlying problems that every generation confronts.
And that's kind of the similar point as Dennis there, and I agree with that. It's obviously physical too, like we're talking about, but it's so important to think about how we think differently about things in government in general, as Jeffrey and I are talking about. There are different ways that we could achieve this. As I think it was it Ron Paul that championed the revolution of the mind, maybe before that? I agree with that. I think that's an important part, if not more important than the political outside.
Yeah, I mean, John Quincy Adams in his July 4th, 1821 address to Congress talked about them. We in the United States, yes, has the march of the mind, unique in the world. He said, Europe, you got the march of the foot soldier. We have the march of the mind. And unfortunately, we've gone away from that. Unfortunately, the species is like that too. You go to Greece, is it Alexander the Great or Socrates who gets the tourist attractions and celebrated and revered? All these countries, they revere the soldier. And the thinker, they have Rodin's sculpture, but don't worry, he's kind of buried in the British Museum if you go there and try to find it. And that's true of all these cultures. You look at the literature, the poems, the romances. It's always, it's always Sir Galahad or Lancelot. It's not King Arthur trying to bring justice. And that has to be changed. Otherwise, it's a matter of time. Since time is infinite, we become more and more proficient at killing each other. We're going to destroy each other. We don't think it's going to happen because our lifespans are tiny compared to infinite time, millions. I mean, I don't even have a word to describe how long the universe has been around. But don't worry, it'll arrive unless we get a hold of ourselves.
Well, where I studied at the University of Chicago, and it was nicknamed the life of the mind because of how academically rigorous the university is. And the university was built around this. When Hutchins became the president of the university, it's a 32, 33-year-old. Initially, the University of Chicago didn't even have an undergraduate school. It just had a good graduate program. They built the undergraduate school. It was built on this, Common Core principles, because it was built under the philosophy that every citizen should be well educated, that there was a separation between you being educated to be a citizen and you being educated to have a profession, to earn a living, that they were considered two distinct different issues. So that's why when you take a look at one of the interests that intrigued me about Chicago, besides going to the place where I could learn about economic freedom and liberty, was the core curriculum, that everyone had to show proficiencies in physical sciences. Everybody had to have proficiency in social sciences. You had to take liberal arts. You had to take humanities. You had to take Western civilization. You had to take non-Western civilization. Okay. You had to know about the world. Okay. It's not like you went in and said, I'm going to be an accountant and just give me a whole bunch of accounting, or I want to be a lawyer, so just give me law courses. At first you have to be a well-informed individual to contribute to society. And what do you need to know to be a well-informed individual? Okay. It can't just be an expert in one narrow field. You have to be able to develop a broad perspective, and a broad perspective means some knowledge in a whole bunch of different areas. And so basically, at Chicago, I think as an undergraduate, I was both an undergraduate and a graduate there. As an undergraduate, I think like the first 2.5 years were all courses that were pretty much mandatory for almost every student, no matter what their major was. They all for half their years as an undergraduate, basically you had some choices, but if I had a humanities course, I had choices of which humanities course to take, but I had to take the same level of humanities as every other student, whether I wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer, an economist, a finance professional, or whatever it is I wanted to do. There was same basic knowledge that we had to build on to be considered an educated person. Okay, we don't really care about being educated people today. So I mean that's. And I think is a serious problem, and I was not disappointed by the experience I had, even though I never went to class. I still was responsible for learning the material, which I learned outside the classroom. I didn't need a teacher to teach me. I can read, so and I can think for myself. So so I never went to class. I was busy trading all the time, so making money. So which is also its own learning experience. Deploying your own capital in capital markets is a learning experience and a humbling experience. You got bad days, and you got to figure out how not to continue to have bad days, or you can't eat, and can't pay your tuition. So, but I think the fact is that we're not an educated society, you know, and you can't graduate people from high school that are uneducated and then figure out that college can then provide a remedial education for all the things people should have learned, you know, as a prerequisite to ending in college, that they don't know any of that stuff. So colleges are basically trying to educate a whole dumb generation of people that really didn't learn very much, you know, while they were you know, in school. And if anything, our test scores keep going down and down, which means the quality of our human capital keeps getting worse. And somehow we have people who have less human capital, but want to be wealthier with less human capital. Okay. Normally you have to invest in yourself first to get a return on your effort. If you're not willing to invest in yourself, then why should you expect a high return on your effort if you're not willing to invest in yourself? Why should anybody invest in somebody who's not willing to invest in themselves? And investing in themselves, this question is, how much time and effort am I going to be put in to being really proficient at what I do? And if I don't put the time in, I shouldn't expect much of a return if I'm not willing to put up the time. And society owes me nothing. Okay? Nothing.
Hey,
Nothing.
Jeff.
And I want one other point I want to get back, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Bruce,
Yeah.
to get back to Humphrey, because I think it raises this topic. Right now, again, we talked about when you're in a perpetual state of war, you have tyranny, right? If you're in a perpetual state of everything being emergency, why is this not clear to anyone that we have a tyrant in the White House? And anyone who keeps saying we're in an emergency, their goal is to be a tyrant, okay? Because that's what, you know, every policy, everything we're doing right now, national security, you know, everyone's an alien enemy, okay? All these immigrants that come in, all these tariffs, all this other type of stuff, all I'm doing is it's all American. A boat carrying a few people, okay, and we don't even know what else is on the boat, and somehow that's a risk to the national security of the country, and we could just start launching missiles against it, okay? And if people come up, the government doesn't even want to show us the video because they probably know how repulsed we'd be if we saw the video. So basically, they're just going to sit and say, oh, God, let me get my minions out there to say, oh, I saw this, and now I can understand why the admiral did what he did. 100% justified. And if the Democrats tell you anything other than that, you know the reason why. They hate the country. They hate the military. That's what they want. They hate the military. They hate the country. We don't need to show you the video. You know that's self-evident that the Democrats hate the country and hate the military. And that's why they're saying this stuff. Trust us. Trust the military. This guy's got all these medals on his shoulder, on his arms and shoulders. Trust him. He used his judgment. You shouldn't question that. You're disloyal. You're not a patriot. You're not American first. You're not making America great if you don't trust what we say. Okay? We don't need to show you any video. Do you know how much of our security will be compromised if we show you that video? We will be unsafe as a people if we show you that video. Don't you understand that? We're doing this for you.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
this
Anyway,
is
Jeff,
really absurd. We have a tyrant in the White House. There should be no doubt about that. We have a tyrant there, using all the language of a tyrant, understanding that, saying that everything is an emergency, that everything is the risk to national security, okay? And that's why under these circumstances, he needs to have uncontestable, unlimited authority to do unchecked, unreviewable authority on everything, because everything is a state of emergency. That's clear, okay? You really have to be deaf, dumb, blind, and stupid to not see we have a tyrant in the White House, okay? It should be clear. And now now with the Humphrey decision, okay, you know, I don't even understand how they even can be going and linking that back to the decision now of who wins, you know, Warner Brothers is, you know, how can we say any agency could ever be independent, okay, if it's completely dependent upon one person?
Yeah. Well, Jeff, first of all, I want to say, Jeffrey, that unfortunately our society is who you know rather than what you know. You know, it's all inside deals. So that underscores why people don't invest with themselves, because they know pure talent doesn't sell unless they got a network of people who help them out for ulterior motives. But putting aside the other issue, I think it's incomplete to just focus on Mr. Trump in the White House. He's got a lot of little helpers. They're called members of the Congress of the United States. You remember Benjamin Franklin?
First, I want to just interfere one point. My issue is not Trump. No. My issue is that we have a tyrant in the White House, and the people are not willing to do anything about it. Yeah, that's my problem. The problem is that he is irrelevant if we do our job. If the
Correct.
people do our job, he's irrelevant. The
And-
fact that we have a tyrant in the White House is not his failing, okay? Because everyone who occupies the White House would have the wet dream of doing it the way Trump does and being a tyrant. So he's not the only one that has that desire that once I get into office, I'd love to be a tyrant. Okay.
Yeah.
He's just been more successful than anyone else. But we're letting him be successful. The fault lies with us as a people.
Yes, but I think the more direct fault is in the Congress. At the convention of delegates in 1787, Ben Franklin said impeachment is a substitute for tyrannicide. Exactly what you're describing in the White House at present. It is inconceivable. And remember, but he then went on later after the convention had concluded and told Miss Powell that they had bequeathed a republic if we can keep it. So it's both Congress and the American people are responsible for addressing tyrants in the White House. And here, I think we get a grade of F. Just Congress does nothing. They don't push back. No matter how insulting the president is, he runs secret government. There's no oversight. He ignores a law as simple as TikTok. He says, I'm not going to comply with the law. I don't like it, even if you enact it and the Supreme Court has blessed it. And there's no pushback. I mean, it's truly amazing. If you examine the 3 articles of impeachment that were voted against Richard Nixon, obstruction of justice and the Watergate burglary, abusing, agency authority and defying a congressional subpoena, compared to the current occupant of the White House. I mean, that looks like a tea party in Nixon compared to what's going on today. And no, there's nothing stirring with regard to impeachment in the Congress. No informal hearings, no formal hearings. And part of it is, I believe, a gross misunderstanding and thinking impeachment is like the guillotine in the French Revolution. You chop people's heads off. No, it means you don't trust the CEO to be a steward of our liberties and rule of law. So he's got to leave office. That's all it is. But again, it goes back to what I call an epidemic of constitutional illiteracy. They don't know what our system of government is about. You have members of Congress not even know we have 3 branches of government, both on the right and the left side. And you have to have a certain threshold of information and integrity in order for self-government to operate. And I think we've fallen below that threshold. And I don't know how we get back to that threshold without education and wisdom, character, not only in public life, in the home, in the church, in the synagogue, among friends. That's a cultural revolution that needs to be undertaken. Because right now we've had a counter-revolution against 1776. And I don't see it going back to the other direction because I don't see any James Madisons and George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons on the scene.
Really quickly, Jeffrey, really quickly. I agree with both of you that I think that this is a problem inherently with education and the American people. But I think it's also, if I am correct in regard to what I think we can prove in some ways, the vote being manipulated, what it shows you is that even at this point, if we were entirely motivated, it would not happen through the political process. It would happen through political motivation and momentum and driving action through what would look like the majority, pitchforks essentially in the street kind of an idea. So it's worth considering that maybe where we are and that maybe there are more people that are beginning to see, and that's why that's happening. But I'm curious what Carey has to say about it. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm muted. It's interesting for me because I wanted to be a constitutional lawyer when I was in college. I was studying constitutional history. I really thought, because I believed in the ideas of the Constitution. For me, it's hard to imagine that just a return to understanding the Constitution could be the remedy, because I subscribe to the Lysander Spooner sensibility of like, well, if it were, what's the quote? I don't want to misquote it. Whether it really be one thing or another, this much is certain: the Constitution is either failed. It has either failed to prevent the government we have, or it's authorized it. And either way, I usually get that perfect, but I'm not a morning person, so forgive me. But I think when we're talking about the lack of education and the lack of critical thinking, where people just accept, well, the government said that those are terrorists, so it's okay to kill them. And by government, I mean, well, this one person who issued an executive order or demanded that the rest of the government subscribe to this belief system. I think that I feel like there's a way, and not saying I have all the solutions, but I feel that there is a way to embody and adopt and implement the ideals of the Constitution while maybe evolving past that particular document as a means to enforce it. And I think this is a long-term evolution. I don't think that tomorrow, if you just got rid of the Constitution, got rid of the government, I think a lot of people would not know how to lead themselves. They've been conditioned for so long to be dependent on this system. I'm not saying that I think that's the, just get rid of it and it'll be fine. But I do think that there needs to be some kind of an evolution, just as there was an evolution from monarchy and divine right to the Constitution. Like, what's the next step there that will work better to ensure freedom and to prevent these kinds of things from happening, which has been going on for a very long time. It's been a slow deterioration, I think, since the Constitution was adopted. And it used to work better, but I think this is kind of a natural deterioration from my historical perspective. And I'm sure there are differing opinions, but I think it can't just be the Constitution and it can't just be the democratic government that keeps people and society, on a prosperous and free course.
No, I mean, I agree with that. I don't think at the outset I think we maintained reasonable integrity with the Constitution. I think we had an inflection point around the time of the Spanish-American War, where we decided, okay, now let's really be an empire. You remember, as late as the 1880s, Woodrow Wilson was writing a book called Congressional Government. If you wrote that today, they'd say stick it in a museum. Congressional government. Congress doesn't even exist. But I do believe that it's the whole nature of thinking about why we exist as a government altered. And I think it altered in part because at the outset, our opinion leaders were all at the brunt of King George III's tyranny. They saw power being abused. They got into power, said, we don't want to have that happen again, right? Then later on, the opinion leaders were the ones in government, right. That like Woodrow Wilson, we're really smart. Let's let government limitless power because we're so smart, we'll get to nirvana, by technocrats. And that, unfortunately, was the beginning of the end in this belief that we're too stupid to march to our own drummer. We need really smart people to tell us how to do things and live our lives and find fulfillment. And that, I think, came about right at the time of the Spanish-American War. And ever since, it's been a gradual trajectory upward with more and more limitless executive power. And it's the war, the national security, the national emergencies. It's all made up. I mean, today, for example, you're more likely to die from a vending machine falling on your head than be killed by an international terrorist incident. Will the government ever tell you that? No. Right? They want you to be frightened, to give them more power so they can spy on everything, so they can intercept this conversation we're having right today. Because that's what the nature of the government is. Frighten people so they'll give you all the power you want to try to manipulate them. And how do you fight back again? I say it starts in the home. Individuals got to just speak up. We don't go to violence. We still have some free speech here, but we got to take risks too. We got to take the same or far lesser risks. The 56 signatories of the Declaration of Independence, they signed their death warrants for these unalienable rights. We got to take at least half that risk, to push back against this idea that, it's better to be an empire. It's better to dominate than have the march of the mind. And if we do this collectively, things will change, but it's not going to happen overnight. And it's not destined to prevail either.
Right.
Many at the time of the founding thought that this was an experiment that would have been exhausted far earlier than today.
This is an interesting follow-up point to Carey then. I see this, and Bruce, a lot of this from my mind comes from doing these shows with you so far, like a republic if you can keep it, and what the ideas behind that wasn't meant to be inevitable. It's an interesting thought. So to Carey's point, I love what you said, and I agree with it. But I think there's two ways to look at it. Is that you can look at the Constitution, as Bruce has highlighted on my whole time doing this, as just the ideals that really, inherent rights, right? God-given rights that apply to humans, but we can only enforce that within our boundaries. And so that's where we're going to apply it. But these are things that don't necessarily have to be, it's not some law that's implanted, right? It's an understanding, it's an ideology. And so people, like we've talked about, can go and start their own society. They're not required to adopt this idea. So it's not something that has to go away as we evolve in new and better ways, like you're talking about, Carey. We can, think about the idea of inherent rights and what that means. And but me, I'm very much in an anarchist mindset, and I don't want government to exist. But even within an anarchistic society, there are rules, no rulers, but there is a guiding societal kind of, structure. And I think it's important to think about that. And I think the Constitution's values and the ideals within it are important, whether or not it's a U.S. government with a piece of paper, So I just appreciate that thought from you, Bruce.
But what I like your answer, Ryan, you don't have to. How did the government, how did the people take care of themselves in the Lord of the Flies with the kids there running around there? They didn't seem to.
Well,
Well,
you always look to take it to this point, and I would love to have a conversation about anarchy, and hopefully Carey can join as well.
Let's schedule another episode.
No, let me just respond really quickly. We won't get into it all, but I'm just going to say that it's unfair to make it about the possible terrible. I mean, look at where we are today in this country with democracy, right? So you can clearly find your place there in any sense, and I think governments tend to make that faster. But I would love to give that experiment a try, and I don't think it's always going to devolve into absolute chaos. I think there is examples of that in history, but I do think we should discuss that in a future panel.
It is worth, and we should go back to Humphrey's executor as you're pointing out, Jeff.
Yeah, I want to going back to this point, and I'll get back to Humphreys because I want to read a quote since we talked about the point that Carey has raised that we've now been talking about. This is an excerpt from the closing speech at the Constitutional Convention. It was given by a guy that most people believe was a pretty wise person, Ben Franklin. So pretty committed to liberty, I would say. I confess. Let me get to the point. Here it is. In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this convention with to this Constitution with all its faults. If they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us, and there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And I believe, Father, that this is likely to be well administered for a course of years and can only end in despotism, and as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. Okay, so there you have it. We had great intentions. We put together this wonderful document, but we know where we're all going to end up. People are corrupted. They'll corrupt the meaning of this. People get into power. They'll corrupt everything, and we're going to end up with despotism, which is where we are today. And to your point, Bruce, maybe it took us, maybe to our credit, it took us longer to get there than maybe Ben Franklin thought it would take us to get there, but we got there. So then, hence, Carey's question is, if this document, as wonderful as it was designed with the geniuses involved in putting it together, has failed, where do we go from now to preserve liberty and freedom? I think who was concerned about these issues, and I know you don't like his remedies, but the person who seemed to be most concerned about the flaws and presented his own opinions on what to do about this was Thomas Jefferson. And what did Thomas Jefferson suggest? He suggested nullification. Okay, let people nullify it. If tyranny gets out of control, let just people on whatever level they operate to just nullify as much of the government as they want to nullify. So that's one idea. Okay, so the other idea was, the Constitution should have a limited life, 19 years, and we start all over again every 19 years. So whatever document we govern ourselves, we've consented to. Okay. Then the other idea was also what Jefferson insisted was missing from the Constitution was the obligation to pay off all debt, within 19 years. Okay. So there was no intergenerational transfer of debt. So, and the question is as a thought experience would we have been better off if some of those ideas were adopted? Would we be better off? Would we have the state of tyranny if we could not pass debt on to from one generation to another? Would we see as much tyranny would we have today? Would we see a military-industrial complex if we could not pass debt on from one generation to another generation? Would we see this military-industrial complex, as a decision a society would make and fund, if they didn't have to issue, if they didn't have the capability of issuing debt, but had to pay taxes, in doing so, and on a local level, if people could just, if ICE comes in and the people in the community say, I'm going to nullify everything you do, okay, because this is a violation. What did the founders say? The founders say you're only responsible for naturalization, not immigration. Immigration's a state issue. Naturalization's a federal issue. Get the hell out of my state, okay? Get the hell out of state, not a federal issue. So I'm nullifying everything that you do, okay? I think that's what Jefferson would like to see done. I think he'd like to see the government just nullify these actions. But then it's the federal government, the senior to the, to the state government. So what the federal government, gets it once it gets, because we have now limited really authority on a state level.
Jeffrey,
To sit back and say that this document, as great as it was, has failed. I mean, this is the reality today. It's failed, and this also leads to my next question. Okay, for the panel. Okay, do you think that the next president, okay, if it's a a Democrat, would you like to see a Democrat president? Because I think probably, it seems from what I just checked the newspaper, that it seems that the court is going to put an end to Humphrey, and they're executing Humphrey. Okay, that's why I use the term execution, because it'll execute Humphrey today, and execute Slaughter, and execute everyone that wants to, except for maybe Powell, because they know Powell's going to be executed anyway sometime in a few months. So why execute him now when Trump will execute him shortly? Okay, so they don't need to do that. So that's why they can carve out the exception, because they know Trump has the right to do it, in mid 2026. So unless, in 8 or 9 months, Powell's executed anyway, so he's going to be irrelevant. So they don't need to do something. They can keep treating the Fed with their twisted logic as if it's separate from everything else, but that's all twisted, perverted, stupid, dishonest logic. Okay, which they know it is, I'm sure, so they're probably going to rule to execute all these people. Not literally, but figuratively speaking. So the question is, would you like to see a Democrat in office expand the court if a Democrat wins in? I mean, you also have the risk that the Republicans will also further expand the court, but that's the problem. Do you think this court is honest and faithful to its statements of its own way of how it interprets the Constitution, with public meaning originalism? And what should we do, if this is the court that could be in place, for another 20 years?
Well, Jeffrey, the question always goes back, is the cure worse than the disease? As bad as Dred Scott was, Abe Lincoln didn't say, well, we got to change the Supreme Court. He said we need to work to overrule the precedents, and ultimately it was in the 14th Amendment. But I need to correct a couple of things. Maybe correction is wrong. Make something more complete. When Jefferson would become president, this idea of nullification quickly went away. There are those in the New England who wanted to reject the Louisiana Purchase, saying you can't make them part of the United States, without an amendment to the Constitution. And Thomas Jefferson said you can't nullify that. It went through as a treaty. And there's implementing legislation. And with regard to the 19 years with Constitution should expire, James Madison said, well, that's wonderful, Thomas. Philadelphia in 1787 was a miracle. You think every 19 years you're going to get another miracle?
That's why I didn't focus on that one. I just said Jefferson promoted remedies. Okay.
I understand. They're legitimate questions, and I'm saying they're not. They have a solid base to them, but again, when the cure is worse than the disease, is what Madison said. He backed away.
So what's better than the government being able to have intergenerational transfer of debt?
On that one, Jefferson was correct. That's the third one, and he wasn't the first one. George Washington said that as well in his farewell address. We should not burden future generations with paying for our debts, and I agree with that. And Jefferson was as president. He downsized the Navy. He downsized the military. It got a little checked because we had to fight the Barbary Wars.
So you think having individuals being able to nullify certain acts of tyranny is worse than the tyranny we see today?
Yes, and I think, and if you look at the Civil War, I think you would explain why that is. Because I do think if that were true, there'd still be people in slavery today, for sure. And that's unfortunate, but slavery exists de facto or all around the world. Given the social pressures and norms and tribalism, that is in fact what I do believe. And if you ask them whether they think government should stay away, they say no. We need some of them. So the government can't do bad.
Now we have everyone enslaved. Okay. No. So we used to have a few people enslaved, which is bad. Now we have more people enslaved.
Well, it's different. Anyway, it's very complex. But anyway, I wanted to make that observation. Now, I surely believe that the internet, the generational transfer of this huge debt is a huge problem. And Jefferson was right on. He ran budget surpluses with Gallatin there. He downsized the military industrial complex. How do we get back, to the proper course? And I continue to insist we have to make education, learning, wisdom.
So you think Bruce, if states could just go tell ICE, we don't want you. This is not your issue. We're arresting you if you come in, and we'll send you back to Washington, D.C. We'll send you to Tom Holman's house. Okay. You think what we're seeing today, ICE behavior, states being able to do that is worse than what ICE is doing now?
I think what you would see, Jeffrey, is it'd be very mixed. In some states, as Illinois, California, would say go home. And other states, they'd invite ICE in and say, you get anybody you can kick out.
They already can do that. So that's not worse. They can already do that. So that's not making it worse. They can already do that. They already can say, bring in your National Guard, bring in ICE. They can't make it worse, because that's something they can already do.
I'm saying, Jeff, they would add the state police force to ICE. They would say, this is wonderful. We can go beyond even what our state constitutions, and we'll reinforce.
And most of the states that want to support ICE are having their police department cooperate with ICE. So that's not making it worse. The states that want to do it. Well, Bruce is gone. So again, what do you think about this, Carey and Ryan?
I'm muted. Sorry. It's always interesting for me because, as you know, as the A word, as an anarchist, a voluntarist, but also someone who's aware that we don't live under those conditions right now. I always have to try to see the perspective through the predominant mentality, which is not mine. But even through that lens, I just don't see there being a political solution at this point in terms of education. Who's going to educate people to have a proper civics understanding? Who do we entrust with that? Do we entrust the schools that have failed to provide that education?
We know the government controls the schools, and we know the government doesn't want to produce what we're all talking about. The government doesn't want educated, informed.
It's everybody on this program.
The government doesn't want to do it. They control the schools. They control the accreditation. Okay, any school that created a liberty agenda, I bet, would never be accredited. And then who knows how the teachers at those schools would be persecuted. If they created that agenda. So yes, I agree. I would like education to be a solution, but you can't just ignore education until people get to college, and then have a bunch of stupid, uneducated people get to college and think you're going to educate them at college. So do I think a government-controlled school system is going to reform the school system? Okay, no fucking way.
Right.
The educator's got to be in the home. It's got to be with the parents. Parents shouldn't have kids unless they're going to educate them in the classics and read to them. I read to my kids Don Quixote, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Greek mythology. If they're not going to have that, then don't have kids. That's an obligation that's got to be underway.
If I have the choice between parents making a decision that they're only going to have kids in case they provide them, this great liberal arts education, and how confident I am of that. No, let's get back to nullification, okay? Because that's not gonna happen. You're hoping for that the probability of that event is so rare. That's a black swan event, okay? So it's so rare. Nullification is real. There are trade-offs involved. I understand the trade-offs involved, but ultimately, if I want something that's never going to happen, that's wishful thinking. So it's wishful thinking that parents are going to sit back and say, I'm not going to be a parent because I didn't go to Harvard. I don't have this broad liberal education, and I'm not willing to spend the time, or I don't have the time because we have to have the parents working, and they get home and they're tired and they don't have time to do that. So and the government is not going to subsidize them like it does a public school system. So the public school system is subsidized. So that's why I send my kids off to a subsidized public school system, because I can't afford the alternative and I don't have the time myself. That's the reality of the society today.
I think it's all these things, guys. I mean, this is the thing. Is it not one of these things alone is like, yes, education is the reality. Yes, it'd be nice if parents would be conscientious enough to not, to choose to have children if they're ready for it. But that's my point about like the ideals and the principles of the Constitution. It doesn't have to be written down. It's the things that can grow and adopt. And I think that's where we are. We can adapt. This is why I often, and we've been talking since we started this panel about the idea of possibly no government in the future, limited government. People are really thinking about this today. And yes, there are many out there who are trying to drive in a different direction. But if you really tap into, I think what is the, like there's a reason like supports collapsing a two-party illusion conversation is largely conservative right now around Trump, is that people want something different. That was my point about the network state, is they're taking advantage of that. But we have an opportunity to present these things as ideals and principles that can guide us in a way like not guided by some centralized government. There's a perfect example in the world for why government leads to where we are now, even if with the best of starting circumstances. So we can evolve this. And I think we have a good panel here to discuss something like this in the future about how we actually set that up. It's a big discussion, but go ahead.
But you just do it in your individual life. It is.
Yes.
No, it's not. But that's what I try to do my whole life, is just try to educate, talk to people about it, get them engaged in books. I have a 100-book reading list. Hey, let's see whether or not, we can educate ourselves to understand the complexity of the human experience and how we can increase benevolence and wisdom and get away from warfare and conflict. And if it's going to fail, well, so be. We don't control everything. Even if our audience is 100 years, 200 years from now, we should do it. We can't just sit back because we don't have an instant, colossal game plan to win in the next week or year or 10 years. Now, is it going to mean
while we're educating for posterity, we can nullify now, okay?
Jeffrey, we are not
now.
And there's nothing that we can do that's going to be visible in our time. But I go back, the very first person who denounced slavery, the very first person who said women are not chattels, we don't know who they were. When they denounced it, there is zero chance of succeeding, right? They're dead. We don't know who they're, but man, they were brave. Somebody has to start the conversation, or else you live in the dark ages forever. If we're the ones who start the conversation, so be it. If nothing happens in our lifetime, and I'm unlikely to, my view is not likely to happen, so be it. Other people took risks. That's our risk. We can die in oblivion, but if we did the right thing, it's still something to make life worth living. But I have to go now, everybody. I apologize. I got to get something else. But I'm grateful, Carey, and everybody for a wonderful contribution here. I said this is a wonderful program, and I hope everybody continues to come back because we want to stimulate people to think about that. And I want to underscore, nobody's infallible. We always want challenges. We refine our thinking with conversation and civilized exchanges. Thanks, everybody. But I got to go. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, and we'll give time for Ryan and Carey to have their closing comments while you go. Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah.
So I think the panel that's now left here, I think we're the ones that, Bruce is a limited government, but I think we fall, in less government than Bruce, or an absence of government. So so I wanted to ask you, you asked, this is a question Gary, the question you raised, I've also raised with Bruce in the past as well, is we should acknowledge that the Constitution had a bunch of brilliant people with who wanted to create a document that was kind of like without precedent, and did a great job, but it got perverted, and so the question is given the fact that we've seen 250 years of perversion of the document, so it no longer resembles anything like its original intentions. Okay, we did get what Franklin and others predicted, that we ultimately would end up in a despotic state because we were corrupt people. So the question is for those of us that love liberty, that love freedom, that would like to see the country return to the ideas and ideals, that had people risk everything they risked. Because I like to remind people, as Bruce does, is the fact that everyone who put a signature on the Declaration of Independence collateralized that with all their goods and their lives. Okay, so no generation has put up the type of collateral behind a statement the way they did. Okay. And now it's easy for whoever occupies the White House that we have all these nuclear weapons and we have troops all over the world and whatever. It's not like they're taking any personal risk in anything that they do. You know, if anything, they're all getting wealthier, no matter what, no matter how incompetent and bad they are, they're all getting wealthier. So it's heads they win, tails you lose, you know, and so they always come out on top. So you know, sometimes there's a win-win, but most of the time it's a win-lose. So where do you think we go from here? What do you think are the most tangible things we can do to sort of like change the trajectory of, you know, us evolving even towards more tyranny? Because, you know, I think that the precedent that the Supreme Court's going to set will be very hard to reverse. I'm not saying it's irreversible, but the question is, how many years is it going to take? You know, you'll have to change the composition of the court, and then eventually down the road, a new court that has a different composition will then have to say, you know, we think that these were poorly decided decisions, like Dred Scott. And like, yes, Dred Scott was a horrible decision, and look what the consequence of the horrible decision was, you know, to our society. So this was supposed to be the least dangerous branch, you know, was the Supreme Court. It was supposed to be protecting us. When the executive and Congress did not do their job, this was supposed to be the last line of defense for us, you know, and now it's morphed into something that defends the executive, and the last people it protects is not us. So what are your ideas, Carey? I'd like to pass this to you.
Yeah, I think I don't want to pretend like I'm the central provider of solutions, but I do think that it's an interesting dynamic, because the more incompetent the government gets, aside from the people who are really the cultists and really believe that, you know, Donald Trump should have the right to order blowing up ships and all that, you know, I think there are a lot of people who can really see that it's not working. Maybe they don't have a philosophical lens to view it through, but I think there are a lot of people who are aware that this government does not work for them. And I don't, you know, they're probably not reading Lysander Spooner, but that's why I make the videos that I make, is maybe not necessarily to convince a Kamala Harris voter or a Trump voter, but I try to reach the people who can see that something's not working correctly. And if I think, as we were talking, it starts in the mind. Everything is in the mind. And until we start like unraveling the programming in there, I don't see much changing on the outside. But if we're talking about the outside, I think that the nature of this government, of how corrupt it is, of how much it fails to serve people, even when it's saying that that's the intention and that's what it does, I think it's going to create the necessity that things become more decentralized, and that communities have to be more responsible for themselves, that individuals have to be more responsible, because FEMA doesn't always show up. That's a perfect example. Like, you cannot rely on FEMA to keep you safe after a natural disaster. So it may not be happening on a grand scale, but I think a lot of communities, especially those that are prone to natural disasters, are finding that they have to find ways to help themselves. And it does happen. Communities do turn out to help clean up neighborhoods. And I'm not saying they have an obligation to do that, but I think if over time, not going to happen tomorrow, but I think if over time, we, meaning people who are ready to evolve past the system, can cultivate different ideas of how people could organize, of how roads could be built, these really practical things, I think it's possible. I don't think it's a one generation thing. I think this is going to take generations of teaching children different ways to be, of not filling their heads with, well, voting is my superpower. I mean, so I make so many videos and I use so much imagery and videos. There's so many videos of mock elections in schools where they have little kids voting in the presidential election, and, you know, they drop their little ballot in. And I think and there's so many conversations to be had about that, about the monopoly on violence and coercion, and why there's so much polarization, which to me is because there's a violent entity that can force half the populations. Well, half the population doesn't vote all the time, but, you know, the slight majority of people who wanted a policy that will be enforced through violence. And that's something I focus on so much in my videos, because we are conditioned to not see that violence. We're conditioned to believe that this is representation, and public servants work for us. And if we don't like them, we can vote them out. But as you're talking about the Supreme Court, there's no guarantee that a government agency is going to check another government agency, because they're all deriving their power and authority from the same thing, which is force and violence. And that's why I talk about it so much. So yes, there are practical solutions and tangible solutions, but I think the real solutions really lie in the mind.
Yeah, I agree. And I you know, it's funny you point out the belligerent actions almost inadvertently, or maybe by design, but it feels inadvertently, is driving people to see what we're talking about. Like you were saying, right? Or like driving people to go, gee, maybe a decentralized future is, or no government is a possible path. And it's because of how crazy it's gotten that's actually becoming something, you know, so but I'm happy to see it. And I'll just end with the point about the Constitution and stuff. It's, I very much align with the ideas of no government and anarcho-libertarianism or whatever the terms are. I never really identify with the terms. I have thoughts that kind of are all over the place, but ultimately that no government is a primary point for me. And that would be what I would want to live in if I could make that the reality today. But to Carey's point, I agree. It seems near impossible where we are with the mental state and the belief in certain things that if you just yanked it away, it would be devolve into chaos. And that would be exactly what has been like engineered by the people who want that to be the case, not the way it would always be in the future, possibly, But the point is that even though that is what I want, absolutely, period, the Constitution is something I find to be very important it was, in my opinion, the best effort I've seen to actually try, and clearly failed now, to check the power of a state of society. And it did have a successful time frame to some degree. I feel like it was smaller than most people say, but it's interesting to think about. If you look at the Constitution, it's not that it's not there anymore. It still exists exactly the same way it did. It's just, but I agree, it has been bastardized, but not to the point to where it's not salvageable if that's something we wanted, because it still applies in the regard to, just citing again, Mayberry versus Madison. If it's repugnant to the Constitution, it's null and void. If we actually were able to stand back and go, okay, every one of these things that are provably unconstitutional or simply no longer exist, the same Constitution would be there. So it's just worth thinking of that. But my opinion, I feel like if it's possible, we should be getting away from it. But the ideals of that don't need to go away. Inherent rights, the idea that everybody has human rights and freedom of movement and, these different things. Well, it's not much Constitution necessarily, but those kind of ideals can continue. And I think that's what we should gravitate towards. So as always, love the conversation. And Carey, thanks for joining today.
I'm going to each ask you to conclude a little differently than I usually do, but I want to make a concluding statement myself and then turn it over to each one of you. And again, this is why I focused on the fact that I think we were told that if the government became tyrannical, ultimately it's up to the individual, the people. Okay, and to me, the peaceful way of the people acting is through nullification. You're in a grand jury. You're in a court. If you see an injustice where the injustice is perpetrated by the government, even if it's legal, okay, the question is, we kind of established a principle in the Nuremberg files. Even this thing, if there are illegal stuff or the law is a horrific law, okay, then there's a responsibility for people to sit back and say, that is a horrific law, and we're not going to subject ourselves to that law. The Nazis did everything very legally. Everything they did, they had courts, they did it all. So they all went to the law. And then when they were asked, they were held to a different standard. Okay, when they went to the Nuremberg trials. So the question is what we're doing is not working. So should the people sit back and only judge the individual and the circumstances, but should they should look at the justice of the law and determine whether the law is worse than the breach of the law, and think it's an unjust law and nullify it. And so I think that's the action. I think that's the action Thomas Jefferson would want us to do, not do nothing. Right now, the strategy is there's nothing we can do unless we can convince 100 million more people. Okay, so I don't want to sit and wait to convince 100 million people, to affect change. I want to sit back and say, what change can I do today that doesn't require me for convincing anyone? But hopefully, more people will also say, what's the one thing I can do that doesn't require convincing anyone else? And the power everyone else has is every time they're sitting in a room where the government is holding judgment against another individual, they can look and sit back and say, maybe this law is horrible. This person is being persecuted. It's not an equal application of the law. The law is being persecuted rather than prosecuted because certain people are getting away with things that other people are not. And so we want to send this to the government. If you want us to convict people, if you want us to even indict people, you got to behave better, okay? We expect more out of you if you want to preserve the right to indict, okay? So that's what I believe is that that grand juries should sit back and hold judgment. That the fact is, are the people who are prosecuting the law, have they earned the right to indict, okay? And whether they have the right to indict is in our hands, okay? It's not in their hands. They can only say, I want to indict this person, but whether they have the success in indicting this person, that resides in us. Okay, that's the only power we really have is everything that gets to a jury. Okay, that's our ability to sit and stop and check government. And so that's my plea all the time is that's the one thing we can do on our own. Okay, that's the one thing that gives us power. Okay, is the jury system. So whether it's and first, the best thing is to do it at the grand jury level. But if the grand jury doesn't do it, then when I sit to a trial, I have an opportunity to also nullify the trial, like they did with the the subway thrower guy. Okay, so they basically nullified it. They said, well, through a sandwich, nobody was going to be hurt by a sandwich. Okay, through a subway sandwich, he knew he was doing something that would cause no physical harm, no threat to the cop. Why are we dealing with this? You know, maybe if they would have subjected this person and say misdemeanor, pay a fine, they would have said, okay, have him go and sign a misdemeanor and have him pay $25. But to sit back and say, I want to put this guy in jail for 30 years because he threw a sandwich, at a cop, people, the jury had some common sense. They said, you know what? The punishment doesn't fit the crime. It's just unjust to say this is a felony for throwing a Subway sandwich at the guy. Bring in the right charge and maybe we'll consider it. But don't bring in these ridiculous charges. And people read the newspapers and they see, gee, you know what? You seem to have an administration that's only finding that the only people in life whoever signed false information, potentially false information on their mortgage application, just happened to be Republicans who Trump doesn't like. Nobody else. There's nobody else in the history of mortgages that might have found wrong. And apparently, even the Republicans who did it, who have been shown to do it, nobody's talking about those. So it should be clear that this is not an equal application of law. And they should sit back and say, when you start indicting a few Republicans along the way who've done the same thing, when you've shown us the process that you went through, rather than you just starting to invade people's privacy, looking to see who you could persecute, how did you find this out? Did you just go up and write and say, I want to see the files to all these people that Trump hates, and let's see what we can find on them? So that's not what people meant by rule of law system. So it seems to me that the people who sit on a grand jury, and if they don't get that information, they should say, well, I'm not giving you the right to indict. Nullify now. Okay. Nullify everything the government does peacefully, but that's your right. Exercise your rights. When you say no to the government on a grand jury or on a jury, you have no obligation to explain yourself. Reach into your own conscience as a human being and sit and make these judgments on your own. And we have an opportunity of living in a freer society, and we can start checking government when we think government acts in a way that is bad for our freedoms, bad for our liberty, inconsistent with what their virtue that they're supposed to demonstrate on their jobs, because they have an obligation to be virtuous. Okay.
And so we're oh, go ahead.
So now I want to say, to conclude this with both Ryan and Carey, I've never done this before, and I probably should have done it before. I definitely should have done it before. Ryan, you go first, and then Carey. How do people find your content? How do people find out the content you're producing, so more people can get exposed to, the high quality content that each of you produce? So how do you want people to find you?
Thank
Ryan,
you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Jeffrey. Appreciate that. Just really quickly to your point, you bring that up often, and it's always important, right? Jury nullification, to the specific point, is what people need to understand. I even think Carey might have even written an article for anti-media a while back about the idea of a jury, somebody standing out with a sign about jury nullification and being arrested for it in a public sidewalk. I don't know if that was you or not, but that's, things like that. It's just wild. They don't want us to know that. But to what Jeffrey's also pointed out in the past, just the idea of nullification from a societal point, or how about I thought it was funny, the point of not saying what I think it actually says, which is to alter or abolish it in regard to the government. That is what it says. And abolish the government being something that people are capable of doing, should we decide that is what we want. And that, in a way, would be nullifying the government entirely. So I think that is very much what we should be thinking about. But to the larger conversation, there's lots of other angles that we should be doing simultaneously. So yes, we should be doing that. But I do also agree that I think education is paramount. And I'm sure we all agree with this, right? We should be focusing on learning, or rather educating the people around us, if they were willing to listen, about the things that we think are important. Have amicable conversations, even if we disagree. Always important, which is why I appreciate the conversation. TheLastAmericanVagabond.com is the place to go for all of our content. As I always say, don't let the platforms out there be the conduit between you and our information. Go to TheLastAmericanVagabond.com. You'll find all the links to the BitChute videos and everything else on the platform itself. So thanks, Jeffrey. Throw it to Carey.
Carey?
Yeah, I love nullification. I did write an article. We had multiple articles about it on Anti-Media. I made a video about it several years ago. I think it's so important. And I think practically and materially in a courtroom, I think it's important. And if, for me, it's like, well, nullify it all, nullify it in your mind. Because I think there are so many people, they don't know about nullification because they're not informed about it. I think that's called the Fully Informed Jury Association is a great source of information on nullification. But there's so many assumptions in people's minds based on what I believe to be indoctrination and programming that this authority is absolute. That even if we can have a limited government, well, but the authority is still legitimate. And so for me, it's about nullifying that belief. That really creeps into so many people's minds, despite their best intentions. And I don't think the problem is with the people. I think it's with the government and the people who seek power. You can find my content you can see my name. You can search that on pretty much any platform. And if you forget how to spell my name, my Substack is called Pleasure to Burn. It's a reference to Fahrenheit 451. But you can find that on Substack. So if you forget my name, pleasuretoburn.substack.com. And I post weekly article or video there. I'm trying to balance out my video and article content, but that's where to find me.
I'll also add that both Carey and I are part of the Independent Media Alliance, and there's plenty of panels coming down the line. So thanks, Jeremy.
What is that alliance? I'm not familiar with it.
Whitney Webb, Derek Bros, and myself started the Independent Media Alliance, which is just a kind of a loose organization of what we originally, the main points was objective, nonpartisan, aware of some of the major central things that are objectively clear in the world politically, and bringing together to have panels on large conversations. No financial mechanism. We all have our own different platforms, but we gather together under that banner just to have, conversations, and it'll be growing from there.
Oh, great. I didn't know that. Well, congratulations on that effort. And Carey, great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you had fun.
Oh, yeah.
And I hope you plan on coming back if your time permits. We'd love to have you every time you want to come. You have an open invitation to be here.
Thank you.
Every Monday or any other time, an open invitation. So great contribution, and
thank you.
And thank you so much. And each of you have a great day, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You too. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.